Today we're going to talk about the care of one of the more common houseplants we encounter, the Spathiphyllum.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
Now, Spathiphyllum, otherwise known as peace lily, the name actually literally translates into leaf spathe, which is referring to this iconic part of the plant right here. Now, this is a genus of over 50 species, and they are totally tropical plants, and they live in these humid forests or often near streams, and they are native to regions like Central and South America, and you could also find them throughout Southeastern Asia as well. Now, if you can't tell by their sail-like flowers, which feature that fleshy spadix and that spathe I just referred to, these are considered aroids, which means that they are in the same family as Anthurium and Philodendron, for example. Now, these plants were discovered in the late 19th century, and then they started to make their way into cultivation pretty shortly afterwards. And almost all of the Spathiphyllum we buy in garden centers and plant shops are cultivars. So that means they're these cultivated varieties that have been selected specifically for certain traits. And they are almost exclusively produced through tissue culture. Now, there are several dozen cultivars that are out there on the market, and some of them are super tiny, only growing to about 6 inches tall, and then you have others that are like really massive, which could grow as tall as me, or maybe even like 4 feet tall, 6 feet tall, and they have very wide leaves and really, really big inflorescences. Now, it's worth noting that these plants are toxic to pets and kids if ingested, so that may be taken into consideration if you have animals or little ones running around. Now, I already talked a little bit about the flowers, but peace lilies typically bloom from January through August, but they aren't always in bloom during those months, and they bloom fairly sporadically. So that's a problem if you really always want to be showcasing them for their flowers, because they're not always going to be in flowers. And most of us probably wouldn't buy them in the market if they looked like this and if they didn't have any blooms whatsoever. So this one is a little bit more interesting, though. I'd have to say this is Spathiphyllum domino, so it has these like white fleckings on the leaves. So that does give a little bit more seasonal interest when it's not in bloom. But for the most part, growers get the plants to flower by giving them gibberellic acid spray, which is a plant hormone that controls this plant's overall development. And once that plant is sprayed, usually within, I would say, like 2.5 to 4 months, it'll start to bloom. And that's actually when you start seeing it in plant shops and garden centers. So if you're looking to get your peace lily to bloom again, it can be a little challenging because they are, as I shared, really sporadic bloomers. But if you give them good light and you keep them moist and you offer up some great humidity, then they are more likely to go and rebloom. Now, the most suitable night temperatures for your Spathiphyllum are going to be typically what you have in your house already, which is somewhere between, I would say, like 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's like 20 degrees Celsius. And this is likely going to get the plant to rebloom again. Now, in greenhouse conditions, they're growing this plant under about 30% shade, and that usually gives the best bloom results. So if you're actually thinking about, well, how can I get my plant to rebloom again, you could take all of that into consideration and try to figure out like the best place that you're going to have it in your house. Now, once they do bloom, you could do something that is called deadheading, and that means essentially cutting off the top of the flower and try to cut it. Of course, this one's in bloom, so I wouldn't deadhead this, but once it starts to brown up, you could then clip down to the base of this because the plant is going to want to shoot out another stalk. Now, some plants will just bloom right again, but that's not really the case of Spathiphyllum. So just prune it as close to the base as possible. Now, typically, we see these creamy white sail-like spathes on our peace lilies, but they are occasionally streaked with like green coloration, and this usually means that they're aging or they're maturing. Sometimes they're moving out of season, so they're going to get some chlorophyll back into these leaf bracts, and that's going to help get the plant some more light. So it's not just the leaves that might be acting as these solar voltaic panels, but you're going to get the spathe to be acting like a solar voltaic panel as well. Now, speaking of light, let's talk about it. Spaths are plants that would abhor direct sunlight. You do not want to put these plants in direct sunlight. You could put them in this bright windowsill, but if they have too intense light, it's really going to damage their foliage. I mean, if you look at this, look how thin and dark these leaves are. And the darker and the thinner the foliage, then it's probably going to be more low light tolerant. But again, the sweet spot for light is going to be that medium to bright indirect sunlight. An eastern window, if you're in the northern hemisphere like I am, would be ideal because it gets that really cool morning light and then has this really solid, gentle light throughout the day. So that's what I would, do if I would give my Spathiphyllum like the perfect light. Now, as far as temperature goes, Spathiphyllum in general are not cold hardy plants, and it goes back to where they grow, which is in that tropical humid forest. So don't leave them next to your AC or to a drafty window. And anything really under 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I would say, that's kind of like 10 degrees Celsius. It's really going to be dreadful for this plant. So it doesn't want to be in anything that's too drafty. Now, heat, on the other hand, may not be that much of an issue. But if you're going to have it like right next up to a place where there's heat coming out, it might dry out the plant a lot, and these plants do get a little like droopy and weepy. If you have the heat on, you're going to want to keep this well watered. Now, some cultivars can manage heat better than others. Some are up to like 108 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really hot. That's 42 degrees Celsius, I believe. But not all cultivars are that heat tolerant. So you just have to really do your research on what cultivar you're getting, and sometimes when you're in the market for this plant, you're not going to see what type of cultivar. So I would say it's going to be better if you stay somewhere between 65 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like the 30 degrees Celsius. That's going to be like the sweet spot for these plants. Now, if plants are grown at higher temperatures, like I said, they typically want to get more water. But another thing to note is if you've seen plants with really narrow leaves that typically wouldn't have narrow leaves, then they were probably grown at a higher temperature. So you might want to mimic some of those that temperature in your home as well. Humidity, I think this goes without saying, but because these are tropical plants, they love humidity. I mean, they absolutely love humidity. These plants, if they get more humidity, then you're probably not going to have to water them as much. So the more humid it is, the less watering you're going to need to do, and the less humid it is, the more watering that you're probably going to do. But this plant doesn't really like to get dry in the least bit. So if you want to actually keep up the humidity, that's going to be great. And when they don't get enough water and the plant dries out, the leaves will start to actually droop and look like super sad. And luckily though, like this plant is actually going to be fairly resilient. So if you catch it drooping, it'll perk right back up within an hour of watering it. Now let's talk a little bit about soil, because part of keeping this plant nice and moist can do with the substrate. Now, you still want a potting medium with good aeration, but you want something that has more water holding capacity. And if you use any grit whatsoever, only keep it to about, I don't know, I would say about like a quarter of the mix. Like let's just say a quarter of the mix, because as soon as you start to do more than that, it can actually negatively affect the growth rate of the plant. And if you're going to add a grit, I would add maybe something a little bit more like vermiculite, because that actually has a little bit of moisture holding capacity while keeping the aeration in the soil. And if you plant this up in, say, like a glazed ceramic planter or plastic planter versus terracotta, then it'll likely dry out less. Now, I have mine in a terracotta planter, as you could see here. So I have to be very mindful and probably water this a little bit more, because that terracotta is porous and it'll kind of suck all that water out of the planter pot. Now, fertilizing can be done, I would say, bi-weekly to monthly, and it's during the growing season. So it's when this plant is actually growing, when it's in bloom. So be mindful of that, because it will start to go a little bit more dormant, in the winter months, and it won't start growing. But a well-balanced organic fertilizer is totally suitable. So if you want the shiny green looking lush leaves, then you could get a fertilizer that is maybe a little bit slightly higher in the nitrogen, so like a 311 or a 312 for instance. But then otherwise you could just have a regular well-balanced fertilizer as well. Now, propagation of spaths usually involves division. So the best way to do this is to take a look at the root ball and see the best place to actually split the plant, if it needs splitting at all. So here you go. This looks a little, aggressive, but what I'm gonna do is just cut right through the middle. You gotta make sure that your fingers are not in the way. I'd probably cut away from my body is a little bit smarter. Although that's really hard to do when I'm demonstrating this, so I'm like wanna be on the floor for this. There you go. So I definitely had some stems that were damaged in the process. Here we go, so I have this one division right here. And this stem will need to be removed because that one came off in the process. Some extra roots right here. And then I have this one division right here. You could probably divide this one more time, but I wouldn't. This, as I had mentioned, I wanted to show this on how to actually divide this, but I would have, from seeing this clump, it was a really tight clump, but it was just really root bound. I would have probably just repotted this into a larger planter pot. But you could see how you can actually divide it as well. Say you had too large of a plant pot and you had 2 small planter pots, then you could actually take the opportunity to plant those up in those 2 planter pots. So that's an option up for you, but I just wanted to show you how you could actually divide your Spathiphyllum. Okay, so let's talk about common problems that come with growing peace lilies. The number one that I already said, and is totally resolvable, is don't let the plant dry out. It'll get droopy, and if you let it get dry for too long, then its leaves will start to dry out, and then you won't have a happy plant any longer, and then eventually you're gonna have a dead plant. Wah wah. So you definitely want to keep on top of this plant's watering, but the great thing is that it will tell you that it wants water. You just have to notice it. Now, the second one is brown tips and edges, and this could be from maybe watering a little bit too less to having too much fertilizer or a lack of humidity. So it could be multiple different things that you might be seeing in your Spathiphyllum. Now, number 3 is keeping it too close to direct sunlight because, as I mentioned before, this could damage the leaves. It will start to curl them under, it'll turn them yellow, and maybe even show signs of necrotic spots, which is just like browning of the leaves. And number 4 is that the leaves may also start to wilt and turn brown around the edges as well. And I would check the roots because they should be really nice and white and fleshy and healthy. And brown mushy bits will need to be totally removed, and the potting medium should be changed out because that could be signs that it's actually dying from the roots. Now, number 5, because spath like these really moist environments and it's growing in a container, sometimes with not a lot of airflow, and it can be susceptible to fungal and bacterial pathogens, and they will often show up as these like necrotic spots around the margins of the leaves, and occasionally there will be this like massive yellowing of the lower leaves in addition to these necrotic spots. So definitely be mindful of this. I would say that some cultivars are more susceptible to these types of diseases than others, so you're gonna have to like probably cut off those areas. Check the roots periodically to ensure the plant is not fully infected, and if it is, then I would say usher that plant out the door maybe. Sorry, just like sometimes it gets a little bit too bad. And finally, as far as pests are concerned, the plant can be susceptible to a range of pests. I mean, anything like mealybugs or thrips, but honestly, I haven't had those concerns with this plant in my home. I would have to say though that fungus gnats, however, on the other hand, can be an issue because if you're keeping the soil really nice and evenly moist, it will attract fungus gnats. Now, luckily, I have a whole video devoted to curtailing fungus gnats in your home, so you could check that out and notice if it's a problem. All right, folks, that's all there is today as far as Spathiphyllum care. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you can't get enough of these videos, then Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and you can hit the notifications button as well because they deliver these sweet video missives right to your inbox. It's very convenient. All right, guys, until next time, see you later.
I'd like to shout out to Squarespace, who is my sponsor for this video. Now, all of my websites, including homesteadbrooklyn.com, houseplantmasterclass.com, and even my personal website over at summerrayne.net, are all built on Squarespace's platform. Now, this is for obvious reasons. They are this all-in-one platform that offers up slick, modern designs that provide incredible user experience. Now, you could customize their already primo templates, integrate your social media seamlessly, and even send out emails. And oh yeah, if you ever need help, their customer service is dope. So if you're interested in checking them out, you can use my link, squarespace.com/summerrayne for 10% off your purchase. Check out the link in the description below.